Welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to those of you on Zoom also. We're delighted now to introduce the second session and introduce our two discussants, Christian Suhr and Catherine Grant, who I'll present in a moment. I just want to double check that everything's going to be there on Zoom before I continue. Okay, thank you. So I'll introduce the two speakers first. I'll just express my gratitude to both because I don't know how often it is that you get such a high-powered conversation across the disciplines or across the different areas of activity. So it's great to have Professor Christian Suhr, who is a filmmaker and professor of visual and multimodal anthropology at Aarhus at this university. He's the PI of the European Research Council funded project Heart Openings, the experience and cultivation of love in Buddhism, Christianity and Islam. And he's author of the film monograph I already mentioned this morning, the fascinating film monograph combination of a book and a film, Descending with Angels, on the invisible dynamics of jinn possession and psychosis among Danish Muslims. He's co-editor of the important collection Transcultural Montage, the edited volume, which I really recommend. And his films have been shown widely, including at festivals, including Copenhagen Docs. Catherine Grant is one of the world's foremost research filmmakers and video essayists, renowned for her work on the audiovisual essay in film and moving image studies. As I was saying yesterday to the students when Katie was kind enough to come and teach a class, it's not given to many of us to have influence at all, but Katie has a global influence in terms of the models she has offered for the kind of work that we do, those of us at least in that sort of area. She's invented a number of forms that have become widely used, like the epigraph film, and writes brilliantly about her own filmmaking and that of others. As one of the organizers of the annual scholarship in sound and image workshops at Middlebury College, she's helped to train what we might call a generation of videographic critics, including Barbara Zecchi here in the room, and including myself. I did this workshop in 2018, which was the best year. No. And she is one of the founding editors of In Transition, the innovative journal of videographic film and moving image studies that we mentioned already this morning. So what I proposed as, or sort of the topic to lead off the discussion. Sorry, could I ask someone to close the door? Thank you. What I proposed was the overarching point of departure of practice as a kind of theme or, as I say, point of departure. The reason for this is that my impression was that filming and filmmaking and editing are for both of these makers and scholars are regular or constant activities. It's a form of investigation, and this is one of Katie's key terms, actually, material thinking that goes well beyond the production of outputs. So I thought it would be very interesting to hear these two highly esteemed makers compare how in their different ways they integrate practice into their work and indeed into their lives, and how the practice in turn guides their concerns and insights. And just before I go on, I should say I forgot to mention that Professor Catherine Grant is currently our honorary professor here at the University of Aarhus, just in case. I did mention that earlier, I think, but I wanted to repeat, as well as a number of other affiliations. So I think what I'd like to do now is to invite you both to describe your work and to say what practice means to you. So perhaps I could ask Katie, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Alan and Matthias, for the invitation to this wonderful event with a marvelous group of people in the room and the invisible masses, possibly beyond, who we cannot visualize, but will be terrified by the thought of nonetheless. Practice in our lives.
63.
That's 63. Don't tell me that. I mean, I suppose I'll talk with a kind of slightly historical perspective. I started because of curiosity about what was happening online. So I was seeing other people's practice. In particular, I mean, there were a number of influences, but Kevin B. Lee is the one I will single out today as somebody who was diversifying our field from the beginning, both in his own person, but also in his choice of the films he made video essays about, which were truly global and enormous numbers of films on East Asian cinema. So I kind of wanted to just put that out there. And Kevin made a lot of work, and he would just be posting it at his blog. And if there was one influence that I haven't necessarily really thought of as such in that way, it was his blogging activity that was perhaps the most inspirational aspect. He wasn't sort of singling out filmmaking, he was writing blog posts as well. And I was running a blog, as many people in the room will know who've come across film studies for free, trying to kind of take to an academic sphere what Kevin was doing for a film critical sphere. And so this practice of making lots of videos and not kind of worrying too much about whether they were going to be world-leading works or, you know, kind of award-winning or published even. I mean, I like the idea of practice not making perfect. You know, I think was very much part of Kevin's contribution to my way of thinking and to many others as well. So that's what I do. I mean, my first video tried to be quite polished, it has to be said. I was still fundamentally an academic at that point. I didn't quite have footnotes, but it was 13 minutes long and had a voiceover, which I've rarely used since. But since then, my model has just been feeling an urge to make, which I actually do feel most days, and trying to make something, not really thinking about what that might be in the first instance. And so, you know, my work is often led by enthusiasms or passions or a particular state of mind and a feeling that I want to make. And so that's where constraints come in for me, because if you feel you want to make, but you don't really know where to begin, which is, you know, even after many years is how I feel, then starting with something rule-based is a great exercise. So the Pedagogies exercise that Jason Mattel and Christine Keithley invented for the Middlebury workshops, where you take 1 minute of continuous audio from an audiovisual media object, and you choose 10 6-second clips from that object, and you put the clips in order, and in any order you like, and you put the audio over the top, is just such a wonderful place to start when you're feeling that urge, which I luckily still feel even after all of these years. So I think that kind of, not quite daily practice, but you know, I made hundreds of videos, most of which are very forgettable, but they weren't forgettable in the moment that I made them. They were a mode of thinking. So I like Ben Spatz's video way of thinking. I did sort of ground my own thinking about this in Barbara Bolt's understanding of Heideggerian practice, which I won't go into too much, but material thinking, as she called it, following other people writing on practice research. And she, you know, was really quite a true Heideggerian. So I think that was the purity of the idea really appealed to me, which was this three-way conjunction between a maker, obviously, an artist or a craftsperson, the materials from which an object might be made, and the tools which are made, which are used to make it. So that works better than limiting it to video way of thinking for me, because in a way it connects it to lots of other artistic practices, not just video, but also sometimes the tools for our videographic practices vary a lot. They may indeed include our own bodies. They don't really usually in my work. I keep my body out of it so far. I'm changing that though, thanks to Johannes Benotto inspiring us, and Chloe Galibert, along with Kevin, putting our bodies in our films. So that kind of materiality of the process for me was formed by the tools. It was really just suddenly being able to conceive of teaching myself using editing tools sometime around 2009 that, you know, led to this. So I can really see how a kind of non-human element, which I will, you know, kind of put into the frame, along with the material, which might be another non-human element, interacts with me as a nonetheless subjectivity to produce the work I do. So although it feels very personal, I think the frequency of it and the materiality of it remove, I think, some of that personality. I'll stop there.
But perhaps I should just say for the, you know, 1.25 people who are online who don't know of your work, you probably should say what sort of material you actually work on.
Yes, I mean, it's material from existing films, television, and other audiovisual media objects.
And we will see some recent examples later on.
So I will bring normally the whole media object into my video editing program. I rarely make subclips to start with, and I don't work with Adobe Premiere partly because of this. I use Final Cut Pro, sorry, no branding,
Yes.
but because it's much easier to work fast.
Yeah.
So that the instrument doesn't get in your way of thinking, and also that you can bring the whole thing in. You don't have to worry about, it does operates to work with quite large amounts of film. And because in a way, having to decide what you're going to use before you bring it into your video editing program is a limiter on what you might do. So I don't like that limit. So I then take my clips down onto the timeline. As you'll see, in a way, the way that my videos often look really represents the mode of working. I often use multiple screens. So that's a sort of build, if you kind of visualize a timeline, multiple screens are built by building layers of timelines above one another and then resizing screens. It's not physical at all, it's completely virtual, apart from the touch of the touch screen or the mouse. But it's very like forming a puzzle or playing around with shapes. It's very graphic. And it's also very immersive with sound. And so those are the kinds of conditions of working for me. But thank you for asking me to specify what I actually do.
As I say, just for everyone here and for the people on Zoom, we will see some examples of both of these Maker Scholars films later on. Over to you, Christian.
Yeah, so I'd also like to just thank for the invitation to come here. Already this morning, I think it was a real gift for me anyway to have this walkthrough of all of these really exciting emergences of different ways of working with these media, which I think just speaks to. It's good to remind ourselves how young this medium is. Like it's a bit more than 100 years, and there's just so much happening and so many new possibilities that will luckily we have the possibility to witness now and be part of. Like what we usually compare ourselves to is writing, which has been going on for many more years. So it's exciting to be, and for me it was very exciting to have this walkthrough of how you see this field developing. And thanks to Matthias and Suhr, and it's good to be back. We have had a good collaboration for many years with the Visual Anthropology program and your work. And lovely to be able to sit with you. I remember, I think the first time I encountered your work was at a moment where I was trying to read a difficult book, a really amazing and beautiful book called The Skin of the Film by Laura Marx. And then I discovered a video which I could see, and it wasn't too long, but it was excellent. It was really actually opening up the possibility to read this work in a different way. So
is that touching film?
Touching film objects.
Yeah,
thank you.
It did include a voiceover, but no.
Text.
Text. Yeah.
There's a version with text, and then there's an audio commentary version with my voiceover. But
anyway, so it's very nice to be able to be here. What the question was about practice.
Practice.
So, and you asked me to reply to this question.
Just think about what it means to you. I mean, I could read what you said to me when I wrote to you about this, and as a prompt, you said, for me, it's not always clear how to separate practice from things that are not practice.
Yeah.
And you talked about how writing a theoretical argument or reading or discussing it are also forms of practice.
Yeah, I'm often reacting like this when I hear this word practice-based something, which is often used, and that I have really hard difficulties to find out if I can do something which wouldn't be a practice, like drink this coffee. It's a kind of practice. So I'm wondering what this concept covers. But we can discuss that, whether it's possible to do something that's not a practice. Maybe it's sleeping. I was thinking about sleeping, whether that's not a practice. but then you can cultivate ways of dreaming. So that would then be a kind of practice. But it's an interesting question to see if it's possible to not practice. But the way I practice of that film came into my way of working. So I began. I was really interested in photography, and for several years I thought this could be a path for me. And then I discovered anthropology, and I got really fascinated with anthropology, and ended up applying so I started studying anthropology, and that was also exciting, but it was also including reading lots of books. And at a certain point, we had the opportunity to go to Egypt with a small scholarship to do a documentary film. I didn't think of that as anthropology. I really thought about that as a way to come back to my original creative interest in photography. But then it just turned out really amazing. It was, we worked with the interactions between tourists and camel drivers at the Giza Plateau, and all of these different kinds of stereotypes that are played out in the immediate sales interaction, where camel drivers use desires and fantasies of tourists to make their business. And it was wonderful to work with film in that context, both for the ability of film to get really close to the those very direct, immediate, small exchanges that are happening, that are words, but they are definitely also bodily movements. And so there was one part that was exciting, and I didn't realize how exciting it was, but I ended up writing lots of essays about things like that, to think about the different practices of Orientalism, you could say. But what was also really exciting, and perhaps the most important, was also a way the film could be used as a way to talk in a deeper way with the people I work with, both the camel drivers that I work with and the tourists and other audiences as well. So the way film can work to facilitate dialogue and reflection, I think is maybe a very valuable thing as well for an anthropologist. So that kind of put me on a track, and I discovered that there was something called ethnographic filmmaking, and actually a very rich discussion of films and experiments with films, and reflections about what can film do and other media than film as well. So that became my what I did, and I in all my work I use film, but I also use writing. I think they are very complementary. I haven't been, so any film, or most, at least the films I do, would contain words, so people say things, but I don't usually add like text on top of that, or voiceover for that matter, though I think there are beautiful possibilities of voiceover, as Barbara just pointed out. I just don't do that so much, but it's just because of lack of skill or something. But I love I love the complementarity of film and text in the way that in a text I can be very precise. I can make a very explicit conclusion. This scholar's name is Catherine.
Catherine Russell.
I can be explicit in that kind of way. This is Denmark. This is Aarhus University, or something like that. Whereas a film would show that, but in a different way, in a kind of analog way that always sort of points in other directions as well. There's always a before and an after of an image. There's always something on the other side of the frame or outside of the frame of the image. If I see a picture of you, you will have a background that this image of you will also will always sort of alert me to, in a way that I don't think text is always so good at. So the destabilization of this excess, you could say, that film always carries with it in any shot, I really think is helpful for writing, so that we sort of can lose the conceptual grasp that we sometimes approach the world with, and which sometimes I think great problems for us. Someone talked about the politics of representation, and in the field I work in, I've worked a lot on the relationship in these very long and ongoing and quite toxic debates about integration and radicalization and Muslims and immigration, and which fills quite a lot in public media. Now it seems that the Russians are taking over, but for some time it has been that topic, and the media debates are often structured around a lot of people who think they know and have a lot of conclusions about what's up and what's down. And I think just an image or a little piece of footage of a person or a couple of people who is able to destabilize that sometimes in very efficient ways. So I think that's, for me as an anthropologist, that's a great value of using film, to sort of always be linked to the fact that social reality is bigger than we can put into a very strict conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, this whole question of the, I suppose you'd say, the excessive character of the image, or that's probably the wrong word, but that was one of the themes of one of the video essays that Matthias chose for the screening we had last night. So you've talked, actually, you've kind of partly answered the next question I had, which is, what does filmmaking as a scholarly practice give you that other practices, in this case writing, do not? I want to ask the same question to you, Katie. And just before I ask, feel free to suggest when we might show a clip or a film at the appropriate moment. We have them queued up already so we can press play on your command.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated to hear Christian talk about how your filmmaking kind of facilitates a proximity. I think you were kind of saying that towards the beginning. And that was the thing that was most striking about my encounter with your work as well, was this awe at the proximity of filming. In an anthropological context. I haven't seen lots of anthropological or ethnographic filmmaking, but I've seen a fair bit, I guess. And in a sense, what I found removed from at least a lot of your filming technique was distance, some kind of positionality of you as a filmmaker. Felt very at ease across a range of different distances from your subjects. You know, they particularly talk about Descending with Angels, with, you know, how it begins is so near to what we're watching, which is so traumatizing and traumatic, both for the people being pictured and for, I suppose, an unaware viewer. But then it kind of, you also have to kind of retreating and watching talking heads at a table or talking bodies. So, I mean, I was just absolutely astounded by that. And I'm really excited to hear you describe that as part of a process of enabling us, both as the filmmaking or the filmmakers, as well as the viewers, to lose the conceptual grasp with which we problematically approach the world. And although I just work on found footage filmmaking, it's a very different field. I think that losing the conceptual grasp is pretty central to what video essays have helped us with. It's shaken us up in a kind of external world sense, institutionally, pedagogically. publishing wise, but in terms of like that kind of moment by moment practice, that's also how I experience it, and I write about this a lot. So my practice, my daily practice, or my kind of more frequent practice, is making the damn videos, but I'm also often left with at a later stage with the desire to return to the work and write about it. So that's a kind of after work for me. And so having gone through a process of losing a conceptual grasp, I'm often struck by how central that is to the methodology I'm articulating and writing. And that's linked to a project that, you know, people were doing a long time ago in the early days of film, work of the formalists in the Soviet Union, and the notion of defamiliarization. And I can see that, you know, it's a kind of strand of your work as well. So I think that, yeah, for me, video essays in a kind of a global sense were a defamiliarizing bath of fire to walk through. And there's some metaphors coming up there. And yeah, so just completely transforming the way I work. I mean, maybe if I'd been a trained filmmaker to start with, I wouldn't have experienced it like that. But because I wasn't and had never had that dream or desire, for me, I did experience that shock of the new methodology. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but
so what are you doing when you write about your work, would you say? I mean, Christian, I don't know that you write about your films necessarily. It's rather that the work is complementary. The prose is complementary to the film rather than necessarily about it. But I'd be interested to know what it is you're doing when you're writing in relation to the films that you make.
Well, that's probably a stage at which I am re-entering the academic domain. And because if I'm writing, it's because I've got to publish it. Or I want to push it. Sometimes it's more positive than that. So I get asked to, you know, I get people commissioning work from me. And so at that stage, I might look back at my recent video practice and think, oh, what would I like to write about? But rarely do I start a video thinking about the writing or whether it will be written up. And I had a couple of examples. I mean, maybe it's a good time to show one. I don't know, but it might take us away from writing. So I'll say a tiny bit more. But my work, I have commissioned projects which may be paid as well. And it's increasingly happening. I'm really available. Anyone out there? And I've had some really interesting turns in my work because of that process. But otherwise, through the kind of practice I was talking about before, these can be really very, very ephemeral things that I end up making, you know, not like in any kind of recognizable genre that could be anything other than totally abject in the online video world. They may be really tiny. I mean, I did make a 7-second long one once, 30 seconds, you know, but I've also made 40-minute long ones. So, you know, sometimes I'm joining works up that I made that I want to write about because I can see a thing happening in them, which is definitely the case of the work that I'll maybe show. And for me, it's, as I said, re-entry into an academic domain because I do then take up the conceptual frame or grasp of my training as a scholar. You know, often the work can be shorter, because it doesn't have to be the whole thing. It's a supplementary or complementary work. But usually it'll have footnotes and it'll have a demonstration of scholarship and a contextualizing of the work so that it kind of enters into a discussion which is verbal and searchable in a way that my video essays aren't necessarily. So it's without that work, would anybody be inviting me to speak without the written component? I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting one. But because I think it is partly because I have thought a lot about what I've done and what others have done, and tried to articulate something about that in a scholarly, comprehensible way that maybe, you know, I get asked to talk about it a bit, but I don't have to write about everything I make. In fact, I really think that would be horrifying, because although I find it much easier and much more compelling to write about my video processes, because it's kind of storytelling in a way my other writing never was. I really don't find writing easy still. So for me, video essays have just been a complete saving as well.
So we'll postpone playing the first video, give Christian a chance to speak to that theme.
Yeah, I also I as much as I love film, I really also enjoy the possibility of writing and the what words can afford and what it means to try to then sit and explicate what is going on. I think that's very helpful, and it's very helpful also for the film practice. I love what you were saying, something that sounded like what authorship is like. I don't recall the exact words, but this thing that when you work with film, and I guess especially when you work with found footage as you do, but I think any film, one of the fascinating things that happen is, of course, that authorship is very complicated. Of course, if you work with films that were authored by others and then you remix them, and that's one thing. But even if you work with a documentary or a fiction film, you might be directing the camera or angling it in a certain way, but lots of other things are happening. Of course, the people that might be in the frame might do other things than you were expecting, but also the table standing there impacts in ways, and even if you're very aware and you try your best to control that situation, there is something really uncontrollable about it, so that it becomes a kind of multi-authored thing. And there is a resistance in these other voices, even if it's a table or another person or the dress of this person. They will continue speaking. You might be able to color grade or, I don't know, do some stuff, but I really find those qualities of co-authorship that are inherent to film really valuable. I think the same is true of writing. It's just less visible. I guess sometimes when we write, I have sometimes the experience of even hearing the voices of. It's not necessarily a pathological condition,
not necessarily,
but you sort of tune into a theoretician. If you work a lot with the theoretician, the ways of thinking, and it kind of can. There's a way that writing is also embodied in that sense, and co-authored, but it's just less visible. So a way I love to write, which is also an easy way of writing. Is to write out a scene in a film, just very meticulously, like you transcribe an interview, but you transcribe it really well with everything. So one of the qualities of that is that it fills a lot of pages very quickly. So if you need to do that, but the other thing is that you really pay attention to a lot of things and pay attention to those other voices that were speaking at different parts in an image, and or sounds, or right now there is a hiss of air condition. You when you pay attention to those things and write it down, it becomes vivid to you, and you start I feel like start discovering other things through that process of writing, and a different kind of written analysis can flow from that process. So this practice of writing I really enjoy a lot, and then coming from that space into the space of theory, or the conversations with the literature that's relevant for those other people who have thought about such things. This is something I really like, working like that. Not only just to produce a lot of pages quickly, but I actually find it really a valuable crossover between those registers of film and writing.
Thank you. I mean, I'll just mention this as something to remind myself and maybe pick it up later, but in several places in your work, you mentioned Dziga Bartov, the great Soviet filmmaker, who talked about the notion of the kino eye, the kind of merging of the filmmaker with the apparatus of filmmaking. And in that sense, then complicating the notion of authorship. And I think it links to what you say about material thinking, this Heideggerian notion of the tool itself as being something you're in collaboration with, rather than brutally deploying, as it were. But I think now might be a good moment to take a look at some work. Katie, which film would you like to show first, and I could ask you to introduce it?
Maybe Semblance as a sort of more technical example than the other one, although the other one shorter. Yeah. So Semblance is a 4.5-minute long video that I made in December, and you'll see at the end the date appears in the video, because I had a sense of finally nailing something. I do work very quickly, but in fact with that video I tried to make it about 2 years before or so, and I kind of did quite a lot of the montage. As you see, it's a split screen video which uses sequences from 2 films which are very precisely arranged. And I did actually arrive at some of the precise arrangements in the first go at this. And then I had a sense of, a kind of, this is a phrase that I talk about a lot and that Barbara and I have discussed as well. It's the so what. Like it was all, look, it's okay, but it's a what? Is it anything? So there's sort of a loss of confidence. Although I sound like a very confident person about my work, sometimes I am, but actually most of the time I can be ridden with doubts that are not crushed by the joy of working. But anyway, for some reason I went back to it. I made in the meantime another video essay about one of the films. These are Céline Sciamma's film Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, portrait of a young lady on fire, portrait of a lady on fire, sorry. And so I kind of thought I'd finished working on that film, but then I realized I actually wanted to return to this work, and what made it happen was the music. In the earlier playings around, I wasn't conceiving necessarily of using an external music track, and then I found one I thought would work really well, and it was literally that choice that made all of these pieces of the puzzle kind of fall into place. So we could maybe play it. Thank you.
Just before we start, can I ask you, can people see the screen okay, even with the sunlight behind? Okay. We can bring the blind down.
Because people online, they get a lot of backlight, and you're mostly cigarettes.
Okay, we'll bring it down.
This could bring it down. I would like to ask, are you planning on speaking while watching?
No, watching. Thank you, Susan.
Mademoiselle? Mademoiselle?
Explain it away. There's a way to explain.
see? I thought I might give it to you.
December 21st.
Indeed.
2021.
Just before Christmas. I actually make lots around Christmas. I don't know why. I'm escaping from something to my study. So, I mean, even watching it now, I'm already beginning to think I'm nearly ready to start writing about this one, which I never felt when I made it. So the context of this work, it's daily practice. It comes out of enthusiasms, blah, 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 blah. But I'm also a scholar, and one of my abiding interests as an academic is authorship and questions of influence, intertextuality, illusionism, adaptation, remake, sequels. So a lot of my work naturally somehow kind of gravitates towards those questions. And for me, the split screen has just been like this amazing device for simultaneous comparison, which is a kind of an affordance that, you know, as scholars of influence and illusionism, we could only have dreamed of how great it would be. As Cristina Alvarez Lopez said about a piece of work she made back in 2011 called Double Life Second Chances, a study of the convergences between Kieślowski's, which one is it again? I'm going to go. La Double Vie de Véronique, and David Lynch's not so famous film Inland Empire, and she made an amazing video about that. But she talked about how she made that comparison, which also uses split screens, in her head before she made it in video. Now, I'm not as gifted a visionary as she is. I couldn't make all of that in my head, but it comes out of an act of exactly that conjuration while watching Siama's film in the cinema for the first time. And it wasn't like I was constantly thinking, oh my God, vertigo, vertigo, vertigo. But there were so many ways in which it made me think that I knew I had to go and explore it. And so what I find there is, of course, much more than occurred to me in the viewing. But also then the music helped me limit it, because there are many more illusions. But in fact, like, who wants to sit and watch a video every single one? I mean, well, maybe some people do, because YouTube is filled with videos like that. But instead, why not just make a 4.5-minute long one that uses the duration of the music as the guiding principle, and the beats of the music, obviously, as the guiding principle for what you include and how you include it. So the process of making is precisely material thinking. It's the music and the film as the films as a material. It's a kind of also, I think, the genre of the split screen video as a form of that media materiality, then the tools, and then me. And as me now, this person who's made lots of these and so on. But I wanted maybe to conclude just what I'm saying about this by this with two comments. One is the writing is coming to me now because of Orpheus. So this film is called Semblance, a particular choice of word. I didn't say resemblance. Semblance is an archaic English word that conveys resemblance, but also conveys pretense and fantasy, a semblance of something. It sort of hints at it, but is it really it? That was a deliberate choice. I didn't need to prove that Siama had said I love Vertigo, and Portrait of the Lady on Fire is my homage to Vertigo. It doesn't really matter in one way. I think, though, the precision of the illusions would hint that she's very aware, especially like the use of vertigo shots, the kind of like in her film, the key moments of illusionism with Hitchcock. But yeah, Orpheus is the thing that links a Vertigo and Portrait of the Lady on Fire. And so all of these turnings of heads, it's not just Siama imitating Hitchcock, it's both of them referring back to a story that turns on turning. And so the final words of Siama's film and the final loss of the love object in Vertigo are all connected in the kind of massively long history of reworkings of that myth, which I need to write to explore a little bit more, I guess.
Thank you. Christian, we'll put this over to you. We'd like to invite you to suggest a clip and to introduce it for us.
Yeah, if it just may,
of course.
So I really think it's an extraordinary piece, this one, and I'm glad I'm not having to write a final analysis about it or something like that, but so I liked hearing this comment, and also your reflection on the word semblance, that it's sort of a taste of resemblance, sort of just before resemblance, but it's this, and hearing you talking about how you, because that was what I felt in it, that this was not providing a definitive conclusion or this and that about women in film, or it's just not, it was this just emergence of understanding, or seeing things that are somehow connected, and diving into it. So and not which is I think is a really important part of what film can do for us, also in relationship to writing, that it sort of allows us into this space that's the emergence of thinking. It's not of course we can make, if we are at a point where we know the exact conclusion, we could add it at the end or something like that, but maybe more important is this way that we can actually be there just at this moment of certain understandings that are emerging in the encounter in a cinema apparently, but also in the timeline. Yeah, like for me, it feels a little bit like being invited on field work with someone who knows. In this case, it's not field work at a particular location, but it's in the archive of films that where this person has met these other people, and your gaze is somehow part of this. I think I have the sense of someone who is looking at the hair, the particular way the hair is made on the back, and you talked about defamiliarization before, which for me also is a very important concept, and maybe we're talking about how we can sometimes use film to defamiliarize ourselves from our conceptual grasp, and maybe sometimes writing can do it in a different way to the way we make film. But there's also something maybe like an undercurrent of this of commonality, or that we are in this together somehow, which is, of course, split screen is quite an amazing way of showing us that we are there is a link between different times and spaces. There's anyway, it's not very precise, but I love this about this work.
I did one thing, because I forgot my second thing, which was actually about a connection with Christian's work as well, which is I'm a bit more team Eisenstein than team Vertov. So for me, I mean, you're right brilliantly about montage in your amazing 2013 book, co-authored book, Transcultural Montage, which I highly recommend for anybody working on montage. It's superb. But it's obviously the two things that produce a third thing. Normally in sequential editing, it will be one shot followed by a second shot, and conjunction, again, the kind of juxtaposition of those produces a third virtual thing.
Yeah.
And here we have two screens producing a virtual thing, but really not a controlled one, very much kind of open to a viewer to kind of look where they will. Of course, there's some directing, but for me, the defamiliarizing act is the split screen. It's what Roger Cardinal in his early work on the mosaic way of looking talks about, and he's obviously somebody hugely influenced by ethnographic practices. He calls peripheralized attention. So it's a very specific form of defamiliarization. It removes our gaze from the center of a screen and forces us to look around. And I found that such a powerful thing, and I've written about that. But for me, it kind of connected with your notion of invisibility, because what is the message of this video? It's a kind of invisibility. It's the in-between of these things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I sure you don't want to be on the team Bertov.
No, sorry.
Because for me, this is not
No.
Eisenstein.
No.
To me, this is, and it's not that I don't want to be on the team Eisenstein or something, but it seems to me that at least sometimes the montage or the intellectual montage that he was proposing was actually quite, maybe I'm wrong, you would know much more about that than I, but providing clear messages, maybe not, but these two shots together go and make a revolution. Kind of like, and where, well, maybe Werther was also in that business, but in a less strict sense,
right.
Which I feel this is Team Werther.
Yeah, okay. You're on anybody's team.
I think we're all on the same side.
But I guess, but one just to Eisenstein for me conceived of spatial montage, and clearly this is spatial montage. So from that perspective, I'm certainly not into this plus this equals this, but instead looking at how meaning is created potentially.
Beautiful.
Christian, over to you. Would you like to suggest a clip for him to introduce it?
So I was just thinking about whether there would be a particular thing that would fit with this. Let's just watch in the order that I suggested, and we'll take the discussion from there. So there was this 4-minute scene in a film called Descending with Angels. Can I just say 2 words for introduction? So it's you're going to watch Aziz and Esther in a situation. It's like it's a meeting in a psychiatric hospital where the patient comes to receive his medicine and to also to receive the practice of psychiatric education, and I need to say that both of the people that you're going to, it's a difficult scene actually. At least for me, it's a difficult scene. But both of the people that you're going to see in the film agreed, very much agreed, and actually wanted this scene to be like this in the film. So that's just important to say when you watch people. And it actually means a lot, especially for the patient. This particular film where he features. And the film overall is a moving in and out of religious practices of healing and psychiatric practices of healing. I guess I shouldn't say more, but it's just one scene. Yeah.
One thing would it be okay if we open, get a little air in, or if people need a little bit air, because it's super thick?
Bit humidity.
Would that be okay? Then just let us know when it's too noisy. Also online. Then we'll go to the door.
Also, while we see it, it's a little disturbing.
Maybe you can open the other one? No?
Just open the after we see it.
We can also, yeah, close it here and then we'll open there.
So just to say again that this is from Descending with Angels, and it was originally 2013 and published as a film monograph in 2019.
Share it. People online. Men hvordan har du det, Aziz?
Ja, det er fint.
Du har det fint.
Stille og roligt.
Ja. Der er kommet svar på din blodprøve.
Ja,
Jeg kan se, at du har i hvert fald taget noget af sevkvælden.
hvad er det?
Du har taget noget af din medicin.
Ja, jeg tager det hele.
Du tager det hele.
Ja.
Det er godt så.
Ja,
Det ligger også i normalområdet.
Ja.
Aziz, så det tror jeg på.
ja.
Så det tror jeg på. Det er jo fordi, vi bekymrer os om dig, Aziz, ikke også? At vi gerne vil have, at du skal have det godt, ikke?
Jo,
Det er det, det handler om for os.
Ja, det er godt.
Ja. Så sådan er det. Men nu, hvis jeg hælder medicinen op, så kan jeg jo spørge dig, om du ved, hvad du får det for. Ved du, hvad du får de her lyserøde tabletter for?
Bivirkninger.
Det er for bivirkninger. Har du nogle bivirkninger, Aziz?
Ja.
Har du nogle bivirkninger?
Hvad?
Har du nogle bivirkninger?
Nej.
Nej. Men den får du for bivirkninger. Hvad med tankerne, Aziz? Hvordan har dine tanker det?
Jeg har ingen tanker.
Du har ingen... lidt har du vel.
Ja.
Det der med at tænke på, at der var nogen, du kunne være vrede på og sådan noget.
Nej,
Det gør du slet ikke.
ellers tak.
Nej.
Nej, jeg er ikke vred fra nogen. Jeg kan godt lide alle mennesker.
Du kan godt lide alle. Kan alle også godt lide dig,
Ja,
Aziz?
det er det.
De vil godt snakke med dig alle
Ja,
sammen.
alle sammen, de snakker med mig.
Ja.
Og det er sød, mand.
Så var det dem der hed simvastatin. Hvad får du dem fra, Aziz?
Mhm.
De der sådan lidt lysebrunagtige. Hvad får du dem for, ved du det?
Nej.
Dem der hed simvastatin.
Ja. Det er blød. Det er blød.
Fordi du har for meget fedt i blodet.
Jamen, det bliver lidt bedre, ikke?
Jo, det gør det. Det sænker nemlig fedtindholdet i blodet.
Ja.
Tænker du også på det, når du spiser?
Jeg går til fitness.
Ja, det er også godt.
Ja.
Men man kan også tænke lidt på det, når man spiser, Aziz. Spiser du mange kager?
3 gange om ugen.
Det er jo alle de der ting, der er meget fedt i. Det er jo ikke godt for dig.
Ja.
Aziz, hvad så de hvide piller? Hvad får du dem for? Har du tjekket? Hvad får du de hvide piller for? Dem, der hedder Cyprexa.
Ja,
Hvad får du dem for?
det ved jeg ikke.
Så hvorfor at du skal have dem? De 3 hvide der, Aziz.
Ja, men det er Cyprexa.
Ja.
Ja, jeg får det.
Hvad de gør i kroppen?
Hvad mener du?
Jeg siger, hvordan virker de på dig?
Ja, det er ved ro.
Ja, det gør de.
Ja,
Nu er du bedre at sove, ikke også?
jo, jeg sover godt. Jeg sover som Stine. Jeg sover hver dag klokken 10.
Ja.
Og jeg vågner klokken 10.
Og så er det også det med de der Cyprexa, Aziz, at man bliver psykisk stærkere af dem, når man har det, som du har det. Det er derfor, det er vigtigt, at du får det hele.
Ja.
Så var der til en uge.
Tak for mig, Berke.
Vil du have posen til at have dem i, eller jeg ved ikke engang, om de kan være der. Den er måske for lille.
Ja, det er lige meget.
Det er den. Den
Jeg
er for
sidder
lille,
lige.
den kan vi bare bruge til affald.
Er det flot slips?
Du har bare flot i tøjet i dag,
Ja, det er
faktisk.
flot, ikke? Jeg har lige købt den.
Ja, og skjorten.
Ja. Vi ses. Christians, vi ses på næste mandag.
Shall I
Yeah,
add
please
some
do
words
comment
to
on
it?
it, yeah.
So, yeah, so it's always hard to take out a single scene from a film, which of course this is in the context of other scenes. But just to link it to what we have talked about. So this is I've known Aziz, the man you see in the film, for 12 years, and this is what it looks like more or less every day that he every Monday when he meets. Now Esther is not in the hospital anymore, but that's the procedure that you go through. And for Esther, and it's maybe I can connect it to the discussion of co-authorship or the collaborative aspects of working like that. So because when you make a documentary film, it's always important to figure out unless you work with candid cameras or something like that, you need to figure out how can we come together with some sort of mutual interest in this project, which might not be the same interests. I can have my scholarly interests. So for Esther, this scene was important to have in the film at this length as a way of showing a form of criticism of how she feels reduced to sort of a secretary of the biomedical industry. That's how she phrased it. And that some of the tasks of care sometimes are diluted in her work, where she feels that she feels that the time she's able, even the amount of time that she's able to be with a patient and to actually attend to the patient is reduced to performing this operation of giving these pills and doing this form of educational thing. For Aziz, the scene and the film as a whole and the book, I think it was a way for him to show who he is to a system that is not always acknowledging it. I think he shows his tie at a certain point, some of those things you can say, but also to tell the story from his point of view, and also in relationship to his community, where there are also some prejudice around his condition, the being ill, experiencing possession or psychosis, or whatever vocabulary you would like to use. So there are these different interests in that, and for me, I was interested in exploring this for personal reasons and for scholarly reasons. But what it gave me was also something in addition to that. So filming those scenes, I think really, and I also filmed healing encounters in the religious settings where Aziz and other people would attend to, which is where he would feel that he got healing through prayer and those things. So some of what he's saying here, like so what he needs to do is to show compliance, and he needs to tick this box in order to get to the next patient. That's really important. And so they have this convention. It's very much a ritual performance. You could say they do this every Monday. So he testifies to the efficacy of the medicines by, for example, saying, so she asked him, do they help? Or a thing like that. And then he says, yeah, but they make me, and then he talks about how they make him sleep so he can sleep, but also says how it makes him sleep from, I don't remember if he says 10 to 10 or something, but it's another way of saying that it makes him unable to perform the prayers that he really feels are his healing. So there are all these implicit messages that are going on in this conversation, and which she knows all about. But they need to find a way to ignore that, to continue their interaction, and to find this kind of compromise that can be livable for both of them. So it shows all of those complexities. It also shows her situation of being a nurse in Danish psychiatry, but also wearing a little, what do you call this, bracelet, which is when she's not a nurse, she's also a practicing Buddhist, and when she gets in, like a lot of nurses, and there's an epidemic of depression, anxiety, and stress among nurses. So when she also suffered from stress, she went to Nepal to stay in a monastery for some time and eat herbal things, and actually started importing it and serving it to her colleagues. So there is also that, like that's another little thing in an image like this. But then there is the filming of this, and the work with the filming with the material in the editing, and the juxtaposition of that to the exorcism that I also worked on, alerted me to the ritual aspects of what she's doing as well, in the way both these religious healings, even if they are very different and operate in different ways. So the exorcism really focusing on kind of amplifying the symptom, getting the jinn to speak, to cry, to the all of this invisible stuff, to really get it to speak, get it to express itself. The psychiatric medicines are more focused around the dampening of those kinds of emotional outbursts. So they are very different. Yet the way both of these interventions are really also interventions that in a ritual way, through repetition, ongoing repetition of speech acts and also material acts, seek to cultivate and reconfigure the sense of self, and what is considered to be a healthy sense of self, to cultivate a different way of perceiving yourself and your environment, so it was a very that was a very interesting for me as an anthropologist to sort of, and which I think came through the work with film, to start noticing that, and in extension of that, maybe also to think about the interesting parallels that film also itself shares with ritual, as also being a medium that really works on our perceptual and conceptual dispositions, and alters them.
So I'd like to take you both. I'd like, or rather, you to invite us into your activity of material thinking when you're putting this stuff together. I mean, this is a question for both of you, actually. I mean, there was a moment in Semblance, Katie, where, is he called Scotty? He jumps into the water underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, and then the character from Portrait of a Lady on Fire jumps into the water from the boat, but it's not synced. And the temptation there, I can imagine, would be to sync it. And that activity of material thinking, where you make a decision like that, I'd be interested to know about. And similarly with this, you talked about the comparison with these other scenes, that if you see the film as a whole, you are implicitly compared in terms of their ritualistic aspects and so on, and their different emphasis on forms of cure. But you also have this images at the beginning of this scene where you see the outside of the hospital, and some of them are very formal. So an almost abstract, formal image of the windows of the hospital. And I'd like to invite you to tell us about that sort of choice.
Yes. So yeah, experience, I suppose, leads you to understand that how best to show, well, the ways you might show a rhyme is not always by reproducing a rhyme of the rhymes. Because if you show them together in a peripheralized attention situation, the viewer may not actually be able to see the rhyme in a way that I want them to see the rhyme. So they'll notice the rhyme, but to be able to see the rhyme, to really be able to recognize it. It happens with music too. So in the film I showed last, that Matthias curated last night, as part of the screening, which is a new film, not yet published, perhaps not even quite finished, called Drill Team. It shows a lot of sonoric rhyming between two films. And there was one moment where I had to choose not to just play them together, as tempting as that would be for the rhythm of my film, which is quite compelling. I needed to actually stagger them and risk a lack of rhythm, or the rhythm being disrupted, in order to show that the later film was alluding to the rhythm of the earlier film. So it's just kind of an experience, but sometimes it'll only work. Like, that's an abstract decision that feels very thought through. It doesn't feel like that when I'm editing, and because the music is also there, and how do I make things fit with the music? But yes, so sometimes it really, like, that uncanniness I want to reproduce, and sometimes I don't want to reproduce the uncanniness. I want us to see the mechanism of the uncanniness more clearly.
So you're thinking in that case, in the case of that particular decision, about the experience of the viewer.
Absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But in such a fast way. It's like quite habitualized now. I'm not kind of having to worry about that sort of, or it's all, like, I don't really think of the viewer in a way, because the process of thinking of the viewer is so automatic for me. I am the viewer. It's the spectator in the text, as Nick Brown would put it in his early work on John Ford's films. So.
So I don't think I wrote a chapter about that particular frame, but it's true. It's there. And it is resonating with other images of other urban environments, so residential environments, and I guess so I'm also filming this. So, and I think in the process of filming, it's a strange combination of being, like you're expressing in your work, which is then happening in the editing, but in a way you're also filming, or you're taking paying attention to different things, and it's and there is. Of course, there are conscious aspects of that process, but there has to be some playfulness allowed as well. You have to allow yourself to just kind of be there, and to with a certain sort of openness, where you may not necessarily know exactly why you're filming this or choosing that piece of. I really like the way you talked about this experience you had in the cinema. What? Something. So I think that something like that comes like this. Just something breaks the attention, and then eventually it also ends up in the in the editing. On a timeline, and sometimes it will disappear if it doesn't continue to resonate. And sometimes you then become conscious of possible meanings it could have, or you elaborate that. So I do think those shots will be pointing to resemblances or semblances between these different urban environments. And I guess now that you're asking me, I think there's also something about the square boxes that are really, if you like, I hadn't thought about it like that, but there's a lot of square boxes, and there's a lot of opinions, strong opinions, a lot of knowledge that's quite solid around these encounters. About what's right and wrong, about who's in and out, and who's part of the community, who's not part of the community, those kinds of things. So I guess you can if you like, you can the urban environments is sort of inviting that kind of and then the people are disrupting that, and the interactions are definitely disrupting those borderlines. Yeah.
So let me pick up on what you said there about playfulness and the kind of, you said there needs to be some playfulness, and this is certainly a feature of your own form of working. The reason I mention this is that, I mean, I feel the whole process of getting a PhD is having any sense of play beaten out of you, like as rigorously as possible. Certainly that was mine. So any, you know, I even used to have jokes in my footnotes that I put there just so that my supervisor could take them out. And so I'm wondering, what then, you know, given that you are two very senior scholars, what is the role and purpose and power of playfulness in your work? The kind of cognitive charge or epistemological power of it.
Well, I mean, here I kind of feel it's necessary to point out that I'm not a very senior scholar in one very straightforward sense. I'm not really employed, and I wasn't when I started this. So I think it's actually really important to point out that I didn't develop this kind of work or gain these enthusiasms when I was in a job. I actually was in a period of two years out, a kind of self-funded sabbatical. I didn't even know if I would go back in, actually. I kind of like, now I'm out again. So thankfully and very luxuriously, and I'm very, very lucky. But I don't know if I would ever have done this work in the academy. So, and I, you know, and it wasn't people in the academy particularly who were inspiring me with this work either. So it didn't come from there for me, didn't come from practice research, even though I was really familiar with that, having run a department with a practice research sort of section. So the play came from being in a position where I could play, and where I wasn't being beaten up, because we still are, people are in an ongoing sense about the norms and the normativity of our profession and our disciplines, the conceptual grasps that we need to lose to make some of this work. You know, and artists developing a lot of practice research also came from outside of the academy into it for good reasons, and you know, have struggled in a way to hold on to their space where they could experiment and play. So I mean, play and experiment is the same thing for me, but you're absolutely right, it's fun. You know, it's a much less anxious process. It is one where you can allow yourself the luxury of humor or a mess, you know, kind of like, or something not being coherent in a conventional academic way.
But my feeling is that it's not the luxury, it's the very method.
Yeah.
So it's the kind of principle of playfulness rather than playfulness being the surplus to be removed.
Yeah, that's right. How could you remove the playfulness of my work? There will be nothing left. And yeah, so maybe that's its value. And I write about this as well because I am very attached to the theories of D.W. Winnicott, who was one of the foremost object relations theorists of play and creative space and potential space as he saw it, which actually maps onto that material thinking triangulation really well as well, because all of those theories have this in-between space which allows us to play. And for Winnicott, talking about mental health, which your film's so eloquent about, you know, it's when we are ill that we don't have that space, that potential space. If people are brought up in not good enough, because he's a very modest man, surroundings of parental care, that's when these spaces do not develop. Whereas in good enough parental care, that potential space is allowed to thrive, and it's from that potential space on a sort of social level where you know, these creative forms, which link to religion, because for Winnicott they come from religion and play are associated, interestingly. You know, so for me these things are kind of definitely something I wouldn't have done. I mean, I started in my 40s. I don't think I would have had the wherewithal, by which I mean all sorts of different things, psychological, economic, academic, professional, to be able to play. And I know that other people in different stages or with different conditions of precarity, you know, that's an unaffordable luxury for many.
If I should add something, Yeah, I think I had the luxury of being. I still I don't know. I guess I am established now. I have a proper position finally, but I still feel very much like a PhD student sometimes. But have to get over that. But I was also very lucky to have supervisors who would allow a space for experiment and being appreciating of experiments and not conforming to very strict ideals of what should be part of a PhD thesis, for example. And so I really think that's important. I also think it's important with discipline and to actually read things or watch things or do a spelling check or things like that is useful also. And also because I think playfulness comes with, actually I wrote a chapter about a scene in this film where definitely it was playful, maybe a bit too playful. And the wife of another patient alerted me to that, and she thought it should be filmed in a different way. She was a professional photographer as well, so she gave me some filming lessons afterwards about how to film an exorcism, and with a more steady hand-holding operation, something about how you. So she disciplined me, and she also offered a tripod to use sometimes. So and that's a long story, which actually is interesting also not only because of the playfulness, but also because, so I think playfulness, like we cannot, it's important to have the possibility of having an openness, but of course discipline and review and feedback from colleagues and the people we work with is important to also make sure that we don't just fall back into prejudice. I think that's so. It's I don't know if playfulness is. Maybe playfulness is an aspect of heartfulness, if you want to use that word.
Heartfulness.
Because. I think sometimes the tricky thing of doctrines, whether they're theoretical or representational in terms of what should be part of a PhD thesis, is that then it can be about fulfilling those boxes, which they don't have any value in themselves. They're just forms that they should be helpful, like they should be used to the extent that they are helpful, but it's important that there is a way in which the work is linked to something beyond those boxes, which to me playfulness is in that direction, or heartfulness, if you want, or something like that. The sense. To come back to your cinema experience, this felt sense of something is here. I think that's important to always have this sort of link to that experience. Yeah.
So at this point, I'd like to open it up to the room, and I'll also take a look at the comments in the chat just to see if there's anything that needs to be pulled out there. But we're sort of at the end of our time, but we have plenty of time for lunch, so we can go on for another few minutes. So if anyone has any questions or comments, yeah, please, Maud.
I'd like to take you on the comment that you just made about documentary and playfulness, and about how that plays out with your participants, because they may not be very willing to have their image played with in a way. So I was wondering how you deal with those relationships of being an ethnographic filmmaker and at the same time making more video essay style, or more like a critical kind of perspective.
Yeah, thanks for this question. And maybe that was also why I tried to just add something to this concept of playfulness, because I think actually this word stands in a tricky relationship to let's say a scene like this, which is also filled with a large history of suffering, of multiple displacements. He's a refugee from Lebanon. His family was refugees from Palestine, and you know, and lots of and then in comes the PhD student who wants to be playful with the camera. So I like your question for that reason. But let's say playfulness in the sense of a certain form of openness and or let's say heartfulness. I don't know if that's just a word that popped up, but something that's not going out there to replicate or to fill certain boxes, but actually is there to listen and pay attention and allow the world or the people to impact. I think that sort of attunement, which I think is very, we can say lots of critical things of observational cinema, which is a big tradition in the field that I work in. But we can also say some good things, and I think really this cultivation of an awareness of those people that you're with, of that world, that situation you are, including yourself if you're filming. Yeah, and so if you work with people who don't like being part of your work, I would suggest stopping. I mean, unless I was just at the School of Journalism yesterday, we were actually discussing the same thing. So I think at least for an anthropologist, unless I work with very powerful figures who exert power over others, I think it's very important to work from a position of consent. And not just consent in the sense that you sign some form before doing an interview or something, but as a continuous process that involves you know, a long-term engagement with people to go back and figure out, are we still okay with this? What's important for you? So I would, for example, show these scenes to people multiple times. We'll discuss the project and we'll discuss our different interests in this project and the value of it. And I remember my anxiety for showing this to Esther and her superior colleagues, because of course this scene was, I thought it was a striking scene that capsulated what I had seen many times, and I thought it would be nice to have that. It would be important to have in the film, but you know, she's a person with a life and a life that needs to continue. So she needed to approve it, and she was crying when she was watching it the first time, and then she just wanted to have it exactly like this. Her superior wanted it to be shortened a little bit. So it's important to be carrying people through the process like that. I think, of course, then eventually you need to stop because you need to publish it, right? So that's I think the important point. That's where it's really important to show the whole thing, make sure that people are still comfortable with it, to talk about what could be the possible implications that you could imagine of such a film. So right now we have a premiere in Cairo for a new film, and there are some, I think, to people here, if you saw that film, it's about religious experiences of light, and there are some scenes where I think if you guys see it, you won't detect that there is a political significance of some of it, but there are certain scenes that are actually really for some audiences, it would be very tricky for them, and it will produce some discussions in Cairo when we have the premiere. So it's important when you can foresee that kind of situation to really discuss it and discuss why do we want that. We could also edit it out. And so if you find out that you're working with people that are not comfortable in front of the camera, you need to either stop or take a discussion about why are we not that, should we do something else? Maybe accept if you work with very powerful people that doesn't deserve that form of attention. But yeah, is that an answer?
Katie, unless you want to add anything there, or take Jacob's question.
Yeah, I'd like listening to you. Two themes seem to stand out to me. One is playfulness that you all comment on. The other is positionality. And I'd like for you to, it'd be interesting for me to try, you can tie these two together. And I could imagine that within the field of visual anthropology, there's embedded theoretical tradition of looking into positionality, the camera operator, subject, observed, observer, and all those kinds of issues that are attached to it. Within videographic research, it's, I mean, maybe we have to become more accustomed to how we negotiate and conceive of positionality. And but I'd just like to hear both of you reflect on, I mean, and to what extent you see yourself as being able to perform playfulness in terms of the positionality of the work, also across the film, particularly in your case, Christian, that they say the positionality of one particular scene shifts to a different kinds of positionality in a different scene. You know, it means as I remember recently a filmmaker, but arguing that well, the discussion about the female gaze and the male gaze is a little not flexible enough, at least in terms of how we, or I think it's conceived of the way that he works with positionality across different scenes, so that in fact very difficult to talk of one, at least gender positionality that pervades an entire work, but it was potentially also more playful. And could you tell us a bit more about how you consider this way of this the potential to work along?
Well, I mean, when you started to ask that question, I was thinking of positionality of authorship.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say a little bit about that before I move on to what you were asking. So because that's a very important question for us. It always has been. But I guess when you start out making work and you don't think anybody's watching it and it's all playful and you're just messing around and you're putting your work on Vimeo, I didn't feel a huge need to frame my work with a statement about who I was and where I was coming from in a kind of autoethnographic process. But obviously I've been making work for a long time now, and I do engage with that process a lot more. I think I always did with my written work, because I am a Latin Americanist. I'm still that. That's my training. And as a white European, Northern European Latin Americanist, I think thinking about positionality has always been required of me, and then also something I've been interested in doing in different ways. So I haven't made too many explicit statements about my authorship, but often when I'm writing about the work, I will, kind of contextualize some of it. And I think, there's a certain amount of my positionality as an author comes through my work. I mean, I made a lot of stuff. Maybe most people haven't seen a majority of it even. I'm sure that's the case. But I think a lot of it is very obviously queer, for example. It's very obviously, interested in what to me as an Anglophone person is foreign language cinema. It's actually rarely on American cinema, for example, or Australian cinema or Canadian cinema. So I think those kinds of things about my general positionality as a person are there. But in the increasingly important and pressing debate about diversification of our disciplines, I'm very aware of my positionality. And I'm very drawn to working on filmmakers who are as well. So I think really in the last years, I've been a long admirer and student of the work of Lucrecia Martel, the Argentine filmmaker. And I'm interested in her work in this positionality of the white woman, for example, as an oppressive force, but as also, you know, the conditionality of Lucrecia Martel's life as a, you know, somebody coming from a very privileged background. So those sorts of things, I think, are things I'm working through at the same time as trying to ensure that the spaces I occupy and in part co-manage respond to these pressing questions. But you actually asked an even more new question for me about the positionality of the work, and the gaze of the work, maybe the kind of way that the work will place a viewer. And I think that that's fascinating. I think that's what Semblance is also about. And maybe when I write about it, I can make that more, I can kind of comment on the what I hope is the eloquence of the work. You know, what we're dealing with in the couple narrative of Portrait of a Lady on Fire is very different from the couple we're seeing in the other screen, or is it? Because in fact, there's a lot of people who write about the queerness of Hitchcock, by which I do not mean particularly the queerness of Alfred Hitchcock, but the queerness of the spaces of Hitchcock films. And Laura Mulvey has made more progress than anyone else in problematizing her earlier understanding of the male gaze. She's way ahead of anybody who might say it's not sophisticated enough, because it's very, very sophisticated now. But and also I'm kind of reminded of the work of Jackie Stacey, who has also looked at that kind of question of subject positions in work, to inquire about the mobility of them. So I think that's a really interesting question with video essays. And for me, that's one reason why voiceover is something I often avoid, because voiceover at its worst plasters over something, like, by which I don't mean the kind of whitewashing, but I mean like producing a kind of weight. It sort of like covers something and homogenizes and monologizes, to neologize there, the work in ways that I prefer to avoid. I'd rather have a much more open space for viewing.
Christian, we need to go over lunch, but I want to give you the chance to have a final word.
On this, being the white male.
It's
Briefly,
that's what I'm getting at, because I can see the importance of significance, but is there room for playfulness? I mean, too important to play around with, you know what I mean, in both your spheres of work and everything.
I guess I don't know even if I'm allowed to talk. No, but in the tradition of ethnographic filmmaking, of course, positionality has been hugely important to discuss. And I think actually ethnographic filmmaking began very early with these discussions, because it's so visible in the interactions that you would see the filmmaker, whoever it is visible in any kind of footage, even if they're not having a voiceover, or in the reactions at least. And of course, there are, I think, so people like Jean Rouge and Edgar Morin and have been important in establishing a space for thinking about authorship and positionality in different ways, and also in terms of how to destabilize different kinds of positions. So it has been part of thinking in ethnographic filmmaking, but not enough. And I think it's definitely lots to do. My own way of one thing is to just pay attention to the fact that other people than white male professors are making ethnographic films, and maybe highlighting that sometimes, and maybe stepping back sometimes to allow other and there is actually amazing things. I was just mentioning some of the work that colleagues in Cairo are doing that I'm really enjoying a lot. For me, I think it's also important to establish collaborations, which also can be formal collaborations. So my latest film is produced with an Egyptian producer, Hala Lotfi, who's a really amazing filmmaker as well, and Mohammed Mustafa, who is a great Egyptian filmmaker and editor as well, and Amira Mortada, who's doing some of the cinematography and also contributed to the story. And I think that kind of that's at least very helpful for me to be pushed around with my particular perspective and have that counted. And I hope that it's also I think it's interesting for them as well. It's been a really wonderful way of working. So, and we hope to continue with this process. So that's one way. And then you talked about positionality across scenes in a single film. So I like it's a slightly different thing than, but but it's wonderful how a film can sort of transform our bodies. We can't help living with the people we meet in the film and the environments that we meet in the film. We hear somebody's breath and immediately it's in us and transforming us, right? And this amazing thing that this and wild thing, which takes it close to ritual actually, that you can have that and be there and be impacted that, and then cut what my colleagues in Cairo calls a European cut. Then cut, and you're somewhere else living differently. You may have a different skin and a certain positionality and a certain certain perceptual and emotional and conceptual dispositions, but they're being reworked through you becoming possessed by what's happening on the screen in a way. So I think that's a fascinating possibility of film to actually destabilize our mode of being in the world. Yeah.
Thanks, Christian. We're going to interrupt you there because we need to go for lunch and we need to be back promptly because we have speakers tuning in from the States, so we don't want to keep them waiting. So could we just thank Christian Suhr and Catherine Grant?